This is supposed to be a sociology burger. Mass-generated and sloppy, yet spicy, juicy, and savory. McDonaldized intellectual fast food for the masses, if you will. Welcome to Sociology Burger. Do you want fries with it?
Our focus today is one of the most chilling and instructive historical documents of the 20th century. The published excerpts from the Confession of Adolf Eichmann, the notorious Nazi official who oversaw the deportation of millions. This material, which Eichmann intended to serve as his explanation and really remarkably as his exoneration, forces us to confront a pretty fundamental and difficult question about the nature of his guilt.
Right. And that question being, does Eichmann's own accounting support his insistence that he was, and I'm quoting here, merely a little cog in the machinery, a detached administrative bookkeeper just executing directives? Or does the evidence he presents actually convict him as a high-agency, fervent ideological driver, what we might call a master of the final solution?
I'm going to argue that Eichmann's primary function, as he consistently frames it, was fundamentally logistical. His entire self-defense mechanism really centers on minimizing his personal moral agency by adhering to and emphasizing the rigid bureaucratic hierarchy and the specialized technical nature of his duties. His account demonstrates how moral responsibility was successfully diffused throughout that totalitarian state structure.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. I believe that the specific details within this confession, the boastful statements, the descriptions of his high-level negotiations, and the historical context of his appointments, all of it reveals a profound level of personal initiative and ideological commitment that goes far beyond that of a simple administrator. He was, I think, instrumental in shaping, refining, and accelerating policy, not merely implementing routine orders.
So let's start where Eichmann himself places the emphasis, his specialization. He defines himself as an administrative expert, executing orders handed down from above. He literally states, "I was merely a little cog in the machinery." His primary admission of guilt is strictly procedural and logistical. He says, I was the one who transported the Jews to the camps. If I had not transported them, they would not have been delivered to the butcher. And to reinforce his point, he immediately equates his own role to that of the official in charge of the railroads. He's reducing human lives to transportable material. And in doing so, he's fragmenting his own responsibility.
I find that self-serving comparison wholly inadequate. And frankly, the evidence he supplies contradicts that minimized role. Yes, his administrative duties involve logistics, sorting card indexes, enforcing the Nuremberg laws, regulating the Yellow Star. But this meticulous attention to detail wasn't neutrality. It was the infrastructure required to carry out an ideological mass murder. Furthermore, his claim of strict adherence that an order was an order, it seems less like bureaucratic rigidity and more like a carefully constructed shield for a later legal defense. He admitted he never received a written annihilation order from Himmler, only oral instructions, and so he claims he acted only as policeman rounding up Jews for the others. But as we know, oral instructions in the SS were often even more potent than written ones.
Right. But when we examine his behavior when he's actually confronted with the reality of the atrocities, his response reinforces this idea of a specialized administrative detachment. When he witnessed the executions at Minsk or the gassings at Litzmannstadt, his immediate reaction, which he reported back to Mueller, it wasn't defined by a moral crisis, but a procedural one. He worried that the crude methods being used were inefficient and were turning his men into sadists, something he claimed Himmler would not stand for. His concern was correctness. He states his department rejected the crude devices of burning temples, robbing Jewish stores, and maltreating Jews on the streets. He wanted the operation to be clean, professional, and codified, which suggests a functionary obsessed with order, not a fanatic obsessed with the killing itself.
But that emphasis on clean, codified methods is exactly what makes him such a terrifying ideological master, not a mere cog. The efficiency was the ideology. He saw administrative perfection as the ultimate form of racial warfare. And, moreover, His confession contains clear evidence of a personal zeal that predates and goes far beyond mere bureaucratic necessity. He was fascinated by the Jewish problem. From the start, he learned Hebrew, and he openly admitted that had he been Jewish, he would have been a fanatical Zionist. That demonstrates a deep personal, intellectual investment in the underlying conflict that ultimately fueled his work.
But that early work was solely focused on forced emigration, not extermination. That early fascination, which became in the 30s, it defined his initial specialty as a demographic engineer.
Sure, but that intellectual commitment led directly to the massive expansion of his operational role in the 40s. We simply cannot dismiss his attendance at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. This was the precise point where the logistical framework he specialized in was officially merged with the political decision for physical liquidation. You do not send a mere transportation specialist to coordinate policy at that level with top Reich leaders.
I can see that the meeting was pivotal, but I would frame his role differently. While he attended, he was still there in an administrative sort of secretariat capacity. He was the man designated to bustle over to Hayrick with a portfolio of invitations and draw up the minutes. He was facilitating the conference, not setting its agenda.
If he was just a facilitator, then why was he chosen to lead the 1944 operation in Hungary? This was perhaps the most crucial single operation of the Holocaust. General Müller explicitly told him they were sending the master to make sure the Jews did not revolt, as they had in the Warsaw Ghetto. And Eichmann says he resolved to act like a master and set an example for future campaigns. This is policy initiative, preventing political resistance, and operational leadership, not just coordinating train schedules. And let's not forget the high-stakes political negotiation, the exchange of 1 million Jews for 10,000 winterized trucks. He admits he personally set that massive figure of 1 million because he was an idealist and wanted to accomplish as much as possible for the Reich. That idealist zeal drove his entire function.
Okay, so I think this brings us directly to our first key contention, right? This tension between autonomy and strict obedience. I see why you emphasize the master mentality in Hungary, but how can he simultaneously be a master when he repeatedly stresses the absolutely rigid hierarchical nature of the SS structure? He states clearly that he would never have danced to my own waltz. He was rigid in following his superiors' orders, even claiming his Jewish advisors abroad, though reporting to him, were respected because they were essentially the long arm of Himmler himself. He insists he was merely the conduit for higher authority, which is precisely the defense of the bureaucrat.
But he himself contradicts this. He contradicts this rigid adherence when he's detailing the negotiations with Dr. Rudolf Kastner regarding the train of privileged Hungarian Jews. He describes negotiating entirely as equals with Kastner, arranging the illegal emigration of a select group of biologically valuable Jewish blood in exchange for maintaining order in the camps. Let's be clear. This was a gentleman's agreement where Eichmann traded lives for operational stability and instructed border police to let transports pass unhindered. This was not logistics. This was him acting as a quasi-diplomat, exercising profound autonomy and high-level political power on the ground to manage the operational risks of the genocide.
That's a compelling argument regarding his autonomy, I'll grant you, but we have to fit that deal back into the chain of command. Even the Kastner negotiation and the 1 million Jew barter were fundamentally subservient to Himmler's overarching strategic goal. Himmler's ultimate objective was clearly military, to motorize the 8th and 22nd Cavalry Divisions with those 10,000 trucks. Eichmann was executing Himmler's directive to turn off the liquidation machine temporarily for a massive military gain. The Kastner deal was essentially a side transaction within that larger framework. So Eichmann's freedom to negotiate was merely the execution of a higher-level command, allowing flexibility for the sake of the ultimate military objective. He was a highly empowered agent, yes, but still an agent.
In trading lives and determining who was biologically valuable proves he was engaged in political, ideological decision-making, not just scheduling train wagons. He wasn't simply told, get the trucks. He was entrusted with the operational initiative to achieve that goal, including making decisions that superseded standard Reich procedures, like allowing illegal emigration.
But that is the terrifying nature of totalitarian bureaucracy. It grants immense power to middle managers to achieve high-level goals. The power he possessed was specialized. He had the power to move Jews, and when the military requested a pause to use that movement as leverage for trucks, he became the necessary intermediary. His power was derived from his specialty, not from initiating policy itself.
Well, if we can't agree on the boundaries of his autonomy, let's look past the logistics and military objectives for a moment and focus on the deep-seated malice that drove these decisions. And that brings us to point 2, professional detachment versus ideological fervor. If he was truly just a detached bookkeeper, why does his bureaucratic facade entirely crumble when he reflects on his ultimate satisfaction? He boasts that his superior, General Mueller, told him, "If we had had 50 Eichmanns, then we would have won the war." And Eichmann found that comment deeply satisfying. Most horrifyingly, even at the very end, he declared, "I will gladly jump into my grave in the knowledge that 5 million enemies of the Reich have already died like animals." And his closing statement, "I must say that I regret nothing." This is not the voice of a neutral functionary concerned only with timetables. This is the declaration of an idealist committed to the total destruction of an enemy.
I don't dispute the profound and repulsive malice in those final, dreadful statements. I don't. But the critical question remains, does profound ideological malice prove political autonomy, or simply a deep internal commitment to the rigid system and the assigned specialization he believed was correct? Eichmann defined his work by correctness and professionalism. He emphasizes repeatedly that his organization rejected the crude devices of burning temples, robbing Jewish stores, and maltreating Jews on the streets. He publicly punished his officer for beating Jews and reported the use of gas fans, not out of sympathy, but because the procedure was turning his men into sadists, which he feared would undermine the regime's control and efficiency. His concern was systematic, orderly dehumanization. He argued that the Jews were to be brought to the concentration camp ready to start work, not sickly and exhausted. This professionalism was intended to avoid messy, passion-driven violence that could undermine the state's codified method of mass murder.
But that professionalism was purely about outward optics and political strategy. It was a sophisticated refinement of evil. We see this exposed when the Allied air raids halted the trains during the Hungarian operation. He confirms that General Kaltenbrunner ordered the forced march of Jews from Budapest to the Reich's border precisely to preserve appearances for neutral foreign countries. The march wasn't executed out of logistical necessity. It was to teach opponents a lesson and prove in Eichmann's words that we will carry on in the most elegant manner in spite of Allied bombing. This confirms that his perceived correctness was a function of political strategy, aimed at projecting an image of organized power and control, not simple bureaucratic restraint. He was consciously choosing the method that served the ideological image best, elevating his role beyond mere transport officer.
Choosing the method that serves the organization's image is often the very definition of professional managerial work, though. The concern for optics and political strategy, especially regarding neutral countries, falls squarely under the mandate of a specialized SS official tasked with managing a sensitive operation. He was managing the external relations of the genocide, not its fundamental policy.
Okay, let's shift then to point 3, the scope of responsibility, specifically regarding foreign operations. This is where the limitations you cite meet the continental reach of his power. While you correctly point out that he coordinated the transports, he insists that in key occupied territories, the work was performed by local authorities. He notes the French police helped hesitantly, Italy and Belgium were failures, and in Hungary he deliberately left the actual mass deportations to Hungarian officials. He argued that observing the loadings would have been interference with the internal affairs of Hungary, because it was technically still sovereign. This suggests his power was often limited by local cooperation.
And that reliance on local forces is important. It meant his role was primarily one of a clearinghouse coordinating available transport resources with the requirements passed down from Himmler.
But that argument minimizes the unique, vast, and unprecedented organizational power his specific office possessed. He was the only department head in the Gestapo with his own foreign representatives, Captain Richter in Bucharest, Daniker in Paris, Wisłany in Pressburg. These Jewish advisors were effectively the central enforcement arm of the Gestapo across occupied Europe. Eichmann proudly states they enjoyed the greatest respect, for each of them was really the long arm of Himmler himself. By having the power to coordinate, enforce, and crucially set the timetables for seizures across an entire continent, he was the essential regulator of the genocide machine. He controlled the flow, overriding local sovereignty through the implicit threat of SS power. He wasn't limited by local police. He was using them as disposable subcontractors within his continent-wide scheme.
The distinction, though, is vital to understanding the fragmented nature of guilt in a totalitarian system. He was a transportation specialist, the one focused on volume, how many units he had to provide, while systematically deflecting the immediate moral responsibility onto the local executors, like the police loading the trains and the ultimate policy decision makers above him. He deliberately made himself a necessary, specialized administrative component that required the cooperation of others, successfully diffusing the immediate onus of the crime.
And I believe this attempt to diffuse responsibility fails because his own evidence proves he was actively engaged in policy implementation that required initiative, ideology, and political calculation. He was the master facilitator. He used his administrative expertise and organizational initiative, that dark idealism, as he called it, to initiate, refine, and accelerate mass murder across a continent, particularly during the critical operations in Hungary. He acted like the master he was sent to be, demonstrating that the machinery ran precisely because its cogs were not neutral, but were instead driven by personal ambition and ideological zeal.
His confession, then, underscores the profound terror of bureaucratic obedience in a totalitarian state. His defense, while entirely self-serving and chilling, it highlights how responsibility was successfully fragmented. He successfully deflected blame by emphasizing his specialization, transporting material for others to liquidate, demonstrating the danger of moral abdication codified into procedure.
Yet he was not just a cog in the machine. He was the primary gear setter. The true horror revealed in this confession is perhaps the way Eichmann successfully fused the passion of the ideological master with the ruthless efficiency of the administrative cog, demonstrating just how easily profound evil can be rationalized and codified through the guise of correctness and specialization.
The document, therefore, forces us to weigh the systemic nature of the crime against the immense personal agency he clearly exercised. We leave it to you, the listener, to decide whether Eichmann's confession proves he was the master orchestrator or just the necessary, terrifyingly efficient cog in the mechanism of mass murder.